The city of Plateau was a place of luxury, where the wealthy roamed in flashy cars, attended grand parties, and lived in mansions that seemed to touch the sky. Among the richest men in the city was Anthony and his group of friends. They had everything money could buy: expensive clothes, private jets, and connections with the most powerful people. To outsiders, they were the perfect gentlemen, successful businessmen with companies spread across the city and beyond. But behind the smiles and glamour, they hid a dark and terrifying secret. They were ritualists. Money, cars, businesses. None of it came from hard work. It came from something far more sinister. They used women for their dark rituals, sacrificing them to keep their wealth growing. The businesses were just a cover, a way to make people believe their riches came from legal means. No one suspected a thing. Anthony, the leader of the group, was the most reckless of them all. He was a man who lived without fear. With money and power, he believed he could do anything and get away with it. He loved women, beautiful women, and saw them as nothing more than toys to be played with. Some he lured in with charm and expensive gifts. Others he drugged to have his way with them. And when it was time to renew his wealth, he chose his victims carefully. The police? They were no problem. Money solved everything. If anyone got too close to the truth, a little bribe was all it took to silence them. Anthony and his friends had built their empire on blood and deception, and no one had ever dared to challenge them. One night, Anthony and his friends sat in a private lounge in one of the most expensive nightclubs in the city. The air was thick with the scent of expensive colognes, cigar smoke, and the sweet perfume of the women who surrounded them. Laughter and music filled the room, and champagne flowed like water. Anthony leaned back in his chair, watching as a waiter refilled his glass. "We need another one," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, but his friends knew exactly what he meant. "Another sacrifice." His closest friend, Raymond, raised an eyebrow. "So soon?" "We just had one last month," he said, swirling his drink in his glass. Anthony smirked. "You know how it is. The more we give, the more we get. And I want more." The others laughed, shaking their heads. Anthony always wanted more. Money, power, women. Nothing was ever enough. "But who this time?" another friend, Josh, asked. "We need to be careful. The last one almost brought too much attention." Anthony waved his hand dismissively. "Relax. I already have someone in mind. This one will be special." Raymond chuckled. "And who is the unlucky girl?" Anthony grinned but said nothing. He loved the thrill of the hunt, the game of winning a woman's trust before betraying her. This time he would take his time. He wanted the next one to be different. As the night continued, they drank, danced, and celebrated as if they had no worries in the world. They were untouchable, or so they thought. The next day, Anthony woke up late in his penthouse, his head pounding from the night before. He walked to the window, staring at the city beneath him. He needed something new. Someone new. And fate was about to bring her right to him. That afternoon, Anthony went to an upscale restaurant to have lunch. The place was filled with well-dressed people, businessmen and women enjoying expensive meals while discussing their next big deals. Anthony took his usual seat by the window, ordering his favorite meal. As he waited, someone walked in, and for the first time in a long while, Anthony felt something unexpected: intrigue. She was stunning. A young woman with deep brown eyes and a soft, innocent beauty. She walked gracefully, wearing a simple but elegant dress, her hair neatly styled. She wasn't like the women Anthony usually met, those who threw themselves at him for money. She had an air of quiet confidence, and that made her interesting. He watched as she took a seat at a table by herself, scanning the menu. Anthony didn't waste time. He stood up and walked over, sitting down across from her without asking. "Hello, beautiful," he said smoothly. She looked up, surprised. "Excuse me? Do I know you?" Anthony smirked. He was used to this. Some women like to pretend to be unimpressed. But he always won. "Not yet," he said. "But I'd like to change that. My name is Anthony." She raised an eyebrow. "That's nice. But I'm not looking for company." Anthony chuckled. "Come on, just one conversation. What's your name?" She hesitated, then sighed. "Victoria." "Beautiful name for a beautiful lady," Anthony said, flashing his most charming smile. Victoria gave a small, polite smile but didn't seem overly interested. Anthony knew exactly what to do. He had played this game many times before. He started talking, making jokes, sharing little stories about himself. but only the ones that painted him as the perfect man. He knew how to make women laugh, how to make them feel comfortable. Slowly Victoria began to relax. She responded to his jokes, her smiles becoming more natural. By the time their meals arrived, they were talking like old friends. Anthony knew he had won. By the end of the conversation, he paid for their meal and they exchanged contacts. Victoria hesitated at first, but Anthony was persistent. He made her feel special, as if meeting her had been the highlight of his day. As he walked out of the restaurant, he felt satisfied. This was going to be easy. Victoria had no idea what kind of man she had just met. She had no idea she was already marked. Victoria sat on her bed, staring at her phone. It had been 2 days since she met Anthony at the restaurant, and to her surprise he had already called and texted multiple times. She had ignored him at first. After all, she wasn't the type to easily fall for a man she just met. But something about him was different. He was charming, confident, and persistent. At first she had been cautious. Men like Anthony, rich and overly confident, always had an agenda. But when she finally responded to his texts, she found herself laughing at his messages, enjoying their conversations more than she expected. He knew how to say the right things at the right time. "Good morning, beautiful. Did you sleep well? Thinking about you today. I hope you're having a great day. I'd love to take you somewhere special. Just name the time." Each message made her smile. She told herself she was just being friendly, that there was no harm in talking to him. But Anthony had a way of making her feel wanted. Over the next 2 weeks they talked every day. He took her out for dinner at the most expensive restaurants, sent her surprise gifts, and even showed up at her workplace once with a bouquet of flowers. Her colleagues teased her, saying she was lucky to have caught the attention of such a wealthy man. Victoria couldn't deny it. Anthony made her feel special. But there were things about him that she didn't fully understand. For one, he never talked about his past. Whenever she asked about his family or how he became so rich, he would smile and change the subject. "Oh, let's not talk about boring things," he would say. "Let's talk about you." And then there were his friends. Victoria had met some of them once when Anthony took her to a private club. They were all wealthy like him, dressed in expensive designer clothes, their eyes sharp and calculating. But there was something off about them. They were too polite, too careful with their words. And when they looked at her, it wasn't admiration in their eyes. It was something else, something she couldn't quite place. That night, as Anthony drove her home, she finally voiced her thoughts. "Your friends, they're different," she said carefully. Anthony glanced at her, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "How do you mean?" "I don't know," Victoria admitted. "They just felt strange." Anthony chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "They're just cautious around new people. You know, being rich comes with a lot of enemies. We have to be careful who we trust." Victoria nodded, but something inside her told her he wasn't telling the full truth. Still, she pushed the thought aside. Anthony had been nothing but kind to her. Maybe she was just overthinking. One evening, exactly a week before Valentine's Day, Anthony called her. "Hey, beautiful," he said, his voice smooth as ever. "What are your plans for Valentine's?" Victoria smiled. "I don't really have any." "Perfect," Anthony said. "Spend it with me. I want to make it special for you." Victoria hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Okay." She could hear the satisfaction in Anthony's voice. "Great. I'll make all the arrangements. Just be ready to have the best night of your life." Victoria giggled. "I can't wait." She had no idea she had just sealed her fate. The moment Anthony ended the call, his smile faded. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of his luxurious penthouse. He had played this game many times before. The thrill of the chase, the excitement of winning a woman's trust. It was all part of the ritual. And Victoria? She was the perfect choice. She was beautiful, innocent, and completely unaware of the darkness she was walking into. Anthony stood up and walked over to a hidden room in his mansion. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, filled with strange artifacts, red candles, and symbols painted on the walls. At the center of the room was a wooden altar, covered in dried blood. This was where the rituals happened. And in a week Victoria would be here too. Anthony smirked, running his fingers over the ritual tools on the altar. "She has no idea what's coming," he whispered to himself. Over the next few days, Victoria found herself thinking about Anthony constantly. She was excited for Valentine's Day, but something inside her felt uneasy. It wasn't anything specific, just small things she had started to notice. For example, whenever they went out, Anthony always chose private places. He never took her to public events or introduced her to his family. And then there was the way he sometimes disappeared. There were nights when he wouldn't call or text, and the next day he would just laugh it off and say he was busy with work. Something wasn't right. But whenever she started to doubt him, she remembered the sweet things he did. The gifts, the calls, the way he made her feel like the only woman in the world. Maybe I'm just overthinking, she told herself. After all, no one had ever made her feel this special before. And so she ignored the warning signs. She trusted Anthony. And she had no idea that Valentine's Day would be the worst night of her life. The days leading up to Valentine's Day felt like a dream to Victoria. Anthony was more attentive than ever, constantly calling and sending sweet messages. Every day she woke up to gifts, expensive dresses, perfumes, and even a diamond bracelet. Her friends were envious. "Girl, you hit the jackpot," her best friend, Peace, said excitedly after Victoria showed her the latest gift Anthony had sent. Victoria laughed. "I guess I did." Peace grinned. "So, what's the plan for Valentine's Day?" Victoria's smile widened. "He wants me to spend it at his mansion. He says he's planning something special." Peace raised an eyebrow. "Alone? No fancy restaurant? No party?" Victoria hesitated for a moment. "Yeah. I mean, it's more intimate that way." Peace shrugged. "Well, just be careful. Rich men like Anthony have secrets." Victoria laughed it off, but a small part of her wondered if Peace had a point. Still, she pushed the thought aside. Anthony cared about her. He wouldn't do anything to hurt her. Meanwhile, Anthony and his friends were making their own preparations. But not for a romantic evening. They gathered in a dimly lit underground chamber beneath Anthony's mansion. The air smelled of burning incense and the walls were covered in strange markings. At the center of the room stood a large black wooden altar with bloodstains from past rituals still visible. Raymond crossed his arms. "Are you sure about this one?" Anthony smirked. "She's perfect." Josh nodded. "It's been a while since we did this. The spirits will be pleased." Anthony walked over to the altar and placed a small silver dagger on it. "After tomorrow night, our wealth will grow even more." The others nodded, their eyes gleaming with greed. Raymond chuckled. "She trusts you, doesn't she?" Anthony grinned. "Like a fool." The group laughed. Everything was going according to plan. The night before Valentine's Day, Victoria had a strange dream. In the dream, she was in a dark room surrounded by shadows. She could hear whispers, low, eerie voices calling her name. She turned around trying to find a way out, but all she saw was a man in a black robe, his face hidden. He held a knife. Then suddenly blood splattered across the walls and she screamed. Victoria jolted awake, gasping for breath. Her heart pounded wildly as she looked around her dark bedroom. It was just a dream. But why did it feel so real? The uneasy feeling stayed with her the whole day. Something wasn't right. She picked up her phone and called Anthony. "Hey love," he answered smoothly. "Are you excited for tonight?" Victoria hesitated. "Anthony, I had a bad dream last night." Anthony chuckled. "A dream? About what?" "I don't know. It just felt strange. And now I feel uneasy about tonight." For a moment there was silence. Then Anthony spoke, his voice soft and reassuring. "Baby, it's just nerves. Maybe because this will be our first Valentine's together. Trust me, I have something special planned. You're going to love it." Victoria took a deep breath. Maybe he was right. "Okay," she said. But her heart still felt heavy. That evening, Victoria dressed carefully, choosing the red dress Anthony had sent her. She looked at herself in the mirror, fixing her hair, trying to shake off the anxiety. She told herself it was just paranoia. Anthony loved her. He wouldn't hurt her. She took a deep breath and left for Anthony's mansion. The moment she arrived, Anthony greeted her at the door with his signature smile, dressed in a crisp black suit. "Wow," he said, looking her up and down. "You look stunning." Victoria blushed. "Thank you." He took her hand and led her inside. The mansion was beautifully decorated, red candles, roses, and soft music playing in the background. It looked perfect, but something felt off. Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Anthony led her to the dining area, where a fancy dinner was already prepared. The food smelled amazing and there was a bottle of wine on the table. He pulled out a chair for her. "Sit, relax." Victoria smiled nervously and sat down. As they ate, Anthony was his usual charming self, making her laugh and making her feel special. But every time she looked into his dark eyes, she felt like there was something hiding beneath the surface. Something dangerous. Then as they finished dinner, Anthony stood up. "I need to grab something from my room," he said casually. "I'll be right back." Victoria nodded. "Okay." As soon as Anthony disappeared upstairs, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. Then she noticed something. On the far side of the room there was a door slightly open. And from inside she could see strange red lights flickering. Her curiosity got the better of her. She stood up and quietly walked toward the door. As she pushed it open slightly, her blood ran cold. Inside was a hidden room with ritual symbols on the walls, a large altar and several strange tools covered in dried blood. Her hands trembled. She suddenly understood everything. Anthony wasn't just rich. He was a monster. And tonight, she was supposed to be his next sacrifice. She gasped and took a step back, but bumped into something solid. Or rather, someone. She turned around and froze in horror. Anthony stood behind her, now wearing a black ritual robe, his expression no longer charming, but deadly. His eyes were cold and empty. Victoria's heart pounded violently. "Victoria," Anthony said, his voice no longer sweet. "You weren't supposed to see this." Her breath caught in her throat. She was trapped. She had walked straight into the lion's den. Victoria's entire body froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared into Anthony's cold, lifeless eyes. The man who had once charmed her, made her laugh and showered her with gifts was now standing before her in a dark ritual robe, his expression devoid of warmth. Her heart pounded. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the blood-stained altar behind him told her otherwise. Anthony took a slow step forward. "Victoria," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I told you to wait in the dining room." Victoria's mouth was dry. She took a step back, but Anthony grabbed her wrist before she could move any further. "You weren't supposed to see this." His grip tightened. "Now you've left me no choice." A cold wave of terror ran through Victoria. He had to escape. But Anthony was too strong. She tried to yank her wrist free, but he held on, his fingers digging into her skin. His other hand reached into his robe, and when he pulled it out, she saw something gleaming in the dim candlelight. A silver dagger. Victoria's breath hitched. He was going to kill her. "No," she screamed, twisting her body in desperation. Anthony's grip loosened for a split second and she took her chance. She jerked her knee up, slamming it into his stomach. He grunted in pain and let go. Victoria ran. Her heart thundered in her chest as she sprinted down the dark hallway. Behind her, Anthony's heavy footsteps echoed, followed by his furious voice. "Victoria!" She ran faster. "Where's the exit? Where's the exit?" She burst into the living room, her eyes darting around wildly. She had to find something to defend herself. Then she saw it. A wine bottle sitting on the dinner table. Without hesitation she grabbed it. Just as she turned, Anthony lunged at her, his dagger aimed straight for her. Victoria swung the bottle with all her strength. Crash! The bottle shattered against his skull, and Anthony stumbled backward, clutching his bleeding head. Blood started gushing out, flowing down his face and soaking into his robe. Anthony let out a weak groan, his body swaying. Victoria took a step back, eyes wide with shock. She had expected him to chase her, to keep fighting. But something was wrong. Anthony wobbled, struggling to stay on his feet. His grip on the dagger loosened. His breathing became shallow. And then he collapsed onto the floor. Victoria didn't wait to see if he would get back up. She turned and ran straight for the front door. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the lock. Finally, she yanked it open and dashed out into the night, running for her life. Cold air slapped her face as she ran barefoot through Anthony's massive front yard. She didn't stop. Didn't look back. Her only thought was escape. Anthony hadn't followed her. Maybe he was too weak from the blood loss. Maybe he had passed out. He didn't care. She just needed to get far away from that house. She reached the main road and waved frantically at a passing car. A cab screeched to a stop. The driver, an elderly man, looked startled. "Miss, are you okay?" Victoria gasped. Drive. Please. Just drive. Something in her voice told the driver not to ask questions. He hit the accelerator and the car sped off. An hour later, Victoria sat in her father's home, wrapped in a blanket, her hands still trembling. Her father, a respected police officer, had listened in horrified silence as she told him everything. When she finished, he stood up abruptly, his face dark with rage. "That man was a ritualist," he muttered, pacing the room. "No wonder his wealth seemed untouchable." Victoria shuddered. "He was going to kill me, Dad." Her father clenched his fists. "Not anymore." The next morning, Victoria's father and a team of police officers stormed Anthony's mansion. They expected to arrest him. But what they found instead shocked them all. Anthony was lying in a pool of blood, motionless on the living room floor. Beside him, the ritual instruments were scattered across the ground, some of them soaked in his own blood. One officer checked his pulse. He shook his head. "He's dead." The room fell silent. Victoria's father exhaled sharply. Justice has been served. But as they searched the mansion, their horror only grew. They found hidden chambers filled with ritual artifacts, blood-stained robes, and files containing names and pictures of missing women, his past victims. It was a house of horrors. The news spread like wildfire. The city was in shock. The wealthy, handsome businessman was a monster all along. But now his reign of terror was over. It took time for Victoria to heal. She had nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. She flinched at shadows, afraid that Anthony might somehow return. But with the support of her father and friends, she slowly regained her strength. She had survived. She had escaped. And now she was free. One evening, months after the incident, Victoria stood by her bedroom window, watching the sunset. She had started a new life, one without fear. But as she turned away, she caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the glass. A shadow. A figure standing in the distance. Dressed in black. Watching her. Her breath hitched. Had she really escaped? Or was the nightmare only just beginning? For weeks, Victoria tried to push the memories away. She told herself that it was over. That Anthony was dead. That she was finally safe. But deep inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The nightmares wouldn't stop. Every night, she saw Anthony standing over her with his cold, soulless eyes, his hands reaching out to grab her. And then there was the shadow. It started a week after his death. At first, she thought it was her imagination. She would see a figure dressed in black, standing across the street or near her house, watching her. But when she looked again, it was gone. Her father told her it was trauma, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But deep down, Victoria wasn't so sure. One evening, Victoria was alone at home. Her father had gone to the station, leaving her with strict instructions to lock the doors and windows. She tried to distract herself, turning on the TV. But her mind wasn't at ease. Then her phone buzzed. She picked it up and froze. There was a new message. From an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. And when she did, her blood ran cold. "You think it's over? It's only just begun." Victoria's hands trembled. Her heart pounded violently against her chest. She could barely breathe. Who sent this? Anthony was dead. He was dead. Then another message came. "Look outside." Victoria's fingers went numb. She slowly turned to the window. And there, standing in the dim glow of the streetlight, was the shadowy figure. Watching her. Nowhere to run. Her first instinct was to call her father. But as she grabbed her phone, the power in the house suddenly went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Then, a knock at the door. Soft at first. Then louder. Bang. 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 Her entire body shook. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. The house had a back exit. She could just get there. But before she could move, her phone lit up again. Another message. "I wouldn't run if I were you." Tears welled up in Victoria's eyes. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. Then sirens. Bright, flashing lights flooded the street as police cars screeched to a stop in front of her house. The banging stopped. Victoria ran to the window, just in time to see the shadowy figure turn and sprint away. But before he could escape, officers tackled him to the ground. The front door burst open and Victoria's father rushed in. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice frantic. Victoria nodded, though she could barely find her voice. Who was it? Her father turned to the officers outside. They pulled the masked figure to his feet. And when they ripped off the mask, Victoria's stomach dropped. It wasn't Anthony. It was one of his closest friends. A man named Daniel who had been part of Anthony's ritualist group. Victoria's father's jaw clenched. So, Anthony wasn't working alone. Victoria swallowed hard. He was trying to finish what Anthony started. Daniel smirked. You think you've won? He hissed. Anthony may be dead, but there are others. Victoria's heart stopped. Others? How many more were there? The officers dragged Daniel to the police car, but Victoria's hands still shook. The nightmare wasn't over. Over the next few weeks, the police conducted deeper investigations. They uncovered a secret network of powerful men who had been involved in the ritual killings. Anthony had been just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. With Daniel's arrest, names started coming out. Wealthy businessmen, influential politicians, even some corrupt officers in the police force. Victoria's father worked day and night, determined to bring every single one of them to justice. And Victoria? She refused to live in fear. She had survived once. She would survive again. The beginning of a new life. Months later, Victoria stood outside her house, breathing in the fresh air. The city was safer now. Dozens of dangerous men had been arrested, their dark empire finally crumbling. She no longer looked over her shoulder. No longer feared the shadows. She was free. A survivor. And she would never be a victim again. As the months passed, the city of Plateau began to change. The once untouchable elites who had built their fortunes on dark and evil deeds were now behind bars. The police had raided multiple locations, uncovering more horrifying secrets. Underground ritual chambers, missing person reports linked to the group, and evidence of their crimes buried deep in their luxurious mansions. The news spread like wildfire. The public, once blinded by the wealth and influence of Anthony and his circle, now saw the ugly truth. The so-called men of honor were nothing but murderers hiding behind expensive suits and business empires. Victoria watched it all unfold, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. She had survived. But what about the other women who hadn't? She thought about them, the ones who had been tricked just like she almost was. The ones who had never made it out. One evening, Victoria sat with her father in their living room, watching a news report about the case. These men thought they were above the law, her father said, his voice filled with determination. But justice always finds its way. Victoria nodded. Justice. That word meant everything to her now. She could have moved on, tried to forget. But deep down she knew she had a bigger purpose. I want to help other women, Dad, she said suddenly. Her father looked at her. What do you mean? I mean. She took a deep breath. I want to start something. A foundation. A safe space for women who have been through things like this. So no one else has to feel as helpless as I did that night. Her father's face softened. That's a brave thing to do, Victoria. It's the right thing to do, she whispered. And so, with the support of her father and other survivors, Victoria started an organization dedicated to helping women escape dangerous situations, educating young girls about warning signs, and working with the police to fight against human trafficking and ritualistic crimes. She turned her pain into power, her fear into strength, her story into a warning and a beacon of hope. And for the first time in a long time, Victoria felt truly free.